The houses she drew, the windows fogged over by dawn. Always. Nora woke before her mother, which was how it usually went. The back seat of the Ford Escape had become its own kind of science. She knew exactly how to curl herself around the wheel. Well, exactly which angle kept her shoulder from going numb. Exactly how many of the dollar store blankets to stack before her feet stopped feeling cold. She was 9 years old. She was very good at this. She sat up slowly, careful not to disturb Claire in the front seat, and pulled her notebook from the backpack she used as a pillow. The cover was held on by 2 strips of masking tape and her name written in blue marker. Nora. Just that. No last name because she'd run out of space and decided a person really only needed the one. She found her colored pencils by feel, opened to a fresh page, and started drawing house number 347. This one had a porch. She'd seen a house with a porch last week when the school bus took a different route, and she'd studied it through the window with a hunger she didn't have words for yet. The way the light sat on the wood planks differently than it sat on concrete. The way a porch said to the world, "We have time to sit here. We are not in a hurry. We belong to a place and the place belongs to us." She drew it carefully. She always drew 3 stick figures in front, 2 tall ones and 1 small one. Mom, her, and someone else she couldn't explain. She'd been drawing that third figure for 2 years, didn't know why, just knew it belonged there. Knew the picture felt wrong without it, like a word you couldn't remember but could feel sitting right on the edge of your tongue. The Target parking lot came to life outside the fogged windows. The first delivery truck backed up to the loading dock. A woman in scrubs hurried toward a Honda Civic, her coffee in one hand and her keys already out. Early shift. People with places to go. Nora added curtains to the upstairs windows, smoke curling from the chimney. A garden, even though she wasn't sure she'd ever actually been in a real garden, just seen them in pictures. Just imagine what it might smell like to be the kind of person who grew things instead of just surviving things. The front seat shifted. Claire was awake. She always pretended to wake up slowly, like she'd been sleeping deeply peacefully, like everything was fine. Nora had known for at least a year that her mother lay awake most nights running numbers in her head. You could tell by the stillness. Real sleep moved. Worry stayed perfectly desperately still. Morning, baby. Morning. The camping kettle went on the cigarette lighter. They had a system. Claire didn't ask if Nora had slept well because the answer was always fine, and they had both stopped pretending fine meant what it used to mean. Instead, she asked what Nora was drawing, and Nora held up the notebook, and Claire looked at it with her eyes still soft from sleep and said it was beautiful. She always said it was beautiful. Sometimes Nora thought it was the truest thing her mother ever said. The water took 7 minutes to heat. They used baby wipes on their faces and hands, working quickly because once the windows cleared, they were visible again, and visibility in a parking lot at dawn was not something you wanted. Nora changed into her school clothes in the back seat while Claire held a towel up at the window as a curtain. They had the routine down to 12 minutes. 1 granola bar, broken in half. Nora knew which half was bigger, had known for months. She also knew that her mother thought she didn't notice. So she took the smaller half and said it looked like more somehow, and watched her mother's face do the thing it did, that quick flicker of something awful. Something grateful. Something that she immediately put away where Nora wasn't supposed to see. "What are you thinking about?" Claire asked. "Montana," Nora said. "That's in the book." "Wyoming, actually. I looked it up. Different state, but right next to it." Claire blinked. "We're not going anywhere, sweetheart." "I know," Nora said, and she went back to her drawing. The school bus stop was 3 blocks away. The same 3 blocks every morning. Nora could walk them in her sleep, which was almost true because there had been mornings when she'd done exactly that. Claire walked her to the corner. Always. Even on the days when it made her late for the library, where she spent her mornings sending resumes into the void. At the corner, Nora turned. Jessica asked if she could come over. Claire's face did the thing again. The flicker. "Tell her we're between places right now, that we'll have her over when we're settled." I told her the house was being repainted. A pause. "That was smart," Claire said quietly. "I know," Nora said again. She climbed onto the bus without looking back, because looking back made it harder, and she was 9 years old and had learned that some things were easier if you just faced forward. The library opened at 9, which gave Claire 40 minutes. She sat in the driver's seat and let herself have 5 minutes of something that wasn't quite crying, more like the thing that came right before crying, the pressure behind the eyes, and the tightening in the chest, and the exhaustion of a person who has been holding everything up for so long that their arms have stopped shaking from the strain and just gone numb. She had been a nurse, registered, licensed, good at it, actually good in the way that surprised people who met her and expected someone more polished, more certain. She was certain in the way of people who had learned to be certain because the alternative was falling apart. And falling apart was not an option when you had a 9-year-old depending on you. Then the car broke down in Spokane. Then the apartment lease ended. Then the nursing license renewal came due $230, and she had exactly $14 in her account, and the food bank only gave out canned goods on Tuesdays. So, here she was. She gave herself exactly 5 minutes. Then she started the car and drove to St. Bridget's Women's Shelter on the east side. Not to stay, she had Nora to think about, and the shelter had a waiting list 6 months long, and she'd heard things about what happened to kids in the system when their mothers ran out of options. So not to stay, just for the mail. Sister Agnes had given her that much. Use us as your address. No one needs to know what it means. The morning was cold. Portland did cold in that wet, settled way, cold that didn't so much hit you as moved into your clothes and stayed there. She walked up the shelter steps, past a woman she recognized from last month, and a girl maybe 17 years old, with a baby on her hip, who looked at Claire with eyes that knew too much. Claire nodded. The girl nodded back. Some things didn't need words. Inside, Sister Agnes was at the intake desk with her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and a stack of folders that seemed to reproduce overnight no matter how many she cleared. 65 years old, 22 years running this place. The kind of woman who had long since stopped being surprised by the world's cruelty and had simply decided to be the alternative to it. Claire, she looked up over her glasses. There's something for you. The envelope was cream-colored, heavy paper stock, the kind that cost money. The return address read Edmund Lark, Attorney at Law, Casper, Wyoming. Claire's first thought was lawsuit. Someone was suing her for something she'd forgotten she owed. The universe's sense of timing had always been spectacular. She opened it standing right there in the lobby. Sister Agnes pretended to be very interested in her paperwork. Dear Ms. Harmon, we are writing to inform you that you have been named as the sole beneficiary in the estate of Walter James Gaines, your late great-uncle. Mr. Gaines passed away 6 weeks ago at the age of 89. His estate has been finalized, and per his explicit instructions, his property located in Fremont County, Wyoming, is to be transferred to you and your daughter Nora upon completion of all legal requirements. The property consists of a log cabin structure on 47 acres of forested land with mountain access. There are no outstanding debts, liens, or encumbrances of any kind. The property is free and clear. Mr. Gaines also left a fund to cover your travel expenses should you wish to inspect the property in person before making any decisions. Please find enclosed a check in the amount of $1,500 for this purpose. We look forward to hearing from you. She read it twice, then a third time. Walter James Gaines. The name sat in her mind like something she couldn't quite reach. A shape in fog. She had a memory hazy, half-formed, of a man at her father's funeral 8 years ago, standing apart from everyone at the back of the reception hall, not talking to anyone. Big hands, quiet face. She had thought he was there for someone else and had been too lost in her own grief to ask. Her great-uncle. She hadn't even known she had a great-uncle. Claire, Sister Agnes, had come around the desk. Someone died, Claire said. Someone I barely knew. He left me property, a cabin in Wyoming. Sister Agnes read the letter over her shoulder. Then she put her hand on Claire's arm. This is from God, she said simply. It could be a shack with no roof. It could be a home. Claire looked at the check in her hand. $1,500, the most money she'd seen at one time in nearly 2 years. I'm afraid to hope, she said. I know, Sister Agnes said. Go anyway. The phone calls came next. She made the mistake of calling Diane first. Because Diane was the oldest, and because somewhere in Claire's chest there lived an optimist, she kept trying to evict and never quite managed to. The optimist believed in family. The optimist believed that blood meant something. The optimist was going to get them both killed someday. Diane answered on the fourth ring. Claire, I'm showing a property in 20 minutes. Dad's Uncle Walter died. He left me property in Wyoming. Silence. Long enough that Claire checked if the call had dropped. Property, Diane said finally. A cabin, 47 acres. Another silence. And in that silence, Claire could hear the calculation happening. The sound of her older sister's brain reorganizing itself around a new piece of information. How much is it worth? I don't know yet. You need to find out before you sign anything. I haven't signed anything. Good. Don't. Not without talking to me first. Diane, you're not equipped for this, Claire. The voice shifted. The realtor voice. The voice Diane used when she needed someone to believe something for their own good. Property management estate taxes the legal complexities of inherited real estate. This is not your area. Sign it over to me. I'll handle the sale. We'll split whatever we get. The we in that sentence was doing a lot of work. Walter left it to me, Claire said, specifically to me and Nora. And I'm sure he meant well, but you're living in your car. A pause, just long enough to be deliberate. Someone needs to make the practical decisions. Something moved in Claire's chest. Not hot, not quite anger. Something older and quieter and considerably more dangerous. I'll be in touch, she said. Claire. She ended the call. 30 seconds later, her phone rang. Marcus, she let it go to voicemail. The voicemail said, you're not actually thinking about driving to Wyoming. Claire, come on, be realistic, call me back. She deleted it. Petra called at 11. Petra had a particular gift for making selfishness sound like compassion, which was the most exhausting thing about her. She started soft. She always started soft. Oh, sweetheart, I heard from Diane about the inheritance. This must be so overwhelming for you. A beat. After everything you've been through, after everything you've done, was what she meant. It's been a difficult year, Claire agreed. I've been so worried about you. And Nora, that poor little girl. Another beat perfectly timed. Listen, I've been talking to Marcus, and we all think it makes the most sense for you to let us handle this. Given your history with financial decisions. Given your history. 2 years ago, Claire had trusted her siblings' promises and paid for it with everything she had. She had handed her share of their father's life insurance to a family that had already decided she didn't matter. Believed their word. Believed blood meant what she'd been told it meant. She hadn't made that mistake twice. Thank you for your concern, Claire said. We just want what's best for you. I'll call when I know more. She hung up. Owen didn't call. Owen never called anymore. She looked at the check for a long time. Then she looked at her nursing textbooks in the back of the Escape, the ones she'd refused to sell, no matter how bad things got. Then she looked at the photograph she kept in the glove compartment, her father holding infant Nora, his face transformed by a joy that made it almost unrecognizable. He had never met Walter. That was what she'd thought. She would think differently soon. They left Portland on a Tuesday morning. The car was packed in 40 minutes, which was not impressive. It only meant they owned very little. Clothes in trash bags, Nora's school things, the nursing textbooks, 3 photographs. The letter from Edmund Lark in the glove compartment where she could put her hand on it if she needed proof this was real. Nora sat in the back with her notebook open. At the top of a fresh page in her careful printing, the journey to our new home. Below it, she'd drawn the Ford Escape with mountains in the distance and 2 stick figures visible through the windows. Claire spotted it in the rearview mirror and had to blink several times before the road came back into focus. They took I-84 east out of Portland as the sun burned through the clouds. Nora pressed her face to the window. It's different, she said. From what? From the city. The sky is more there. More there. Claire turned it over in her mind. The sky is more there. She had spent 2 years with her eyes mostly down, watching sidewalks and parking lots, in the faces of potential employers who would smile and say, we'll be in touch, knowing they wouldn't. She had forgotten to look up. She looked up now. The Columbia River Gorge opened on their right, basalt cliffs, dropping straight down to greenwater landscape that made you feel small in a way that was somehow a relief. Like the world didn't need you to hold it up. Like it had been here for millions of years and would be here for millions more, and your problems, as devastating as they felt, were temporary things in a very long story. Mom, Nora said. Yeah. Do you think there will be mountains? Wyoming has mountains, yes. Real ones with snow. Real ones. Some of them have snow all year. Nora made a sound of pure, uncomplicated joy. And Claire thought, whatever that cabin is, Whatever it turns out to be, this moment is worth it. This sound she just made is worth every mile. They drove until mid-afternoon, then pulled into a rest stop outside Baker City, Oregon. Peanut butter sandwiches on a picnic table. The sky going orange and purple on the horizon. Nora spread the paper map across the table and studied it with the focused intensity of a small general planning a campaign. "We went 260 miles, she announced. "Tomorrow we need to go at least 300 to make it to Idaho." "You've been counting." "I've been planning." She drew a line with her finger, then through the rest of Idaho and across into Wyoming, then south to Casper. She looked up. "Mr. Lark's office is in Casper." "That's right. His name sounds like a character in a story." "Maybe we're in a story." Nora considered this. "If we are, we're at the part right before everything gets better." Claire sat across from her 9-year-old daughter and felt something she didn't have a name for yet. Too complicated for hope. Too precise for gratitude. Something that lived between those two things in a territory she hadn't visited in years. "Yeah," she said. "I think that's exactly where we are." They slept in the rest stop parking lot, semis idling nearby, the interstate never quite silent. Claire woke twice from dreams she couldn't remember, but that left her checking the glove compartment to make sure the letter was still there. Both times it was. Both times she lay back down and watched the darkness and ran the math one more time. The math still worked. The math worked like a miracle, which was suspicious, which was the problem with miracles. You wanted to trust them. You'd been burned too many times to trust them. You trusted them anyway because what was the alternative? Day 2 took them through the rest of Oregon and into Idaho, and then into the strange flat beauty of the Snake River Plain, where the sky went on forever in all directions, and the mountains were just rumors on the horizon. Nora navigated with the paper map and kept a running log in her notebook. Miles traveled, states crossed, animals spotted, 3 deer, 1 coyote, a hawk sitting on a fence post that watched them pass with complete indifference. "I think that hawk was judging us," Nora said. "Hawks judge everyone." "How do you know?" "It's a hawk thing." "Did you learn that in nursing school?" "I'm sure there was a section." Nora giggled, the giggle of a kid who had discovered that her mother was occasionally funny, which was a fairly recent development, and which Claire valued more than she could say. They crossed into Wyoming in the late afternoon of the second day. And something shifted. The landscape didn't change dramatically. Still scrubby high desert, still big sky, but something in the quality of the light was different. Like the place had its own frequency, and once you crossed the state line, you just felt it. In your chest, in the backs of your hands. "There," Nora said. She was pressed to the window. "There what?" "The mountains. I can see them. On the western horizon, barely distinguishable from the clouds, the first shapes of the Wind River Range were materializing, dark and enormous and utterly indifferent to anything that happened beneath them. The permanence of them made everything else feel appropriately sized. Nora was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Can we see them from the cabin?" "I don't know." "I think we can," she said, not wishful, matter of fact, the statement of someone who had decided to believe a thing and intended to be proven right. Edmund Lark's office was on a side street in downtown Casper. A brick building from the 1940s, the kind that had settled so firmly into its foundation, it seemed to have grown there. Brass placard by the door, the name worn smooth by decades of hands. They were 30 minutes early. They sat in the car. "Are you nervous?" Nora asked. "Yes, me too." She smoothed her skirt. She had changed in the gas station bathroom into her one good outfit, the navy blue dress that still fit if you didn't breathe too hard. She had also, without being asked, brushed her hair and put on the small barrette that usually lived at the bottom of her backpack. "I think being nervous is okay," she said. "It means it matters." "Where did you hear that?" "I made it up." Claire looked at her daughter, this specific, impossible, improbable child. "Let's go," she said. Edmund Lark was 70 years old with silver hair and the kind of face that came from spending more time outdoors than behind a desk. He rose when they entered, which not everyone did. He offered Nora his hand first, which fewer people did. He treated her like a person with business to conduct, not a child to be managed. "You must be Nora," he said. "Yes, sir." "Walter mentioned you." Nora blinked. "He did. He never met me." "He knew about you." Lark straightened and smiled at Claire. He knew quite a lot, actually. Sit down, both of you. We have some paperwork, and then I'd like to drive you out to the property. The signing took 20 minutes. Claire's hand was steady. She'd made peace with shaking hands 2 years ago and simply worked through it. Today her hand was steady. She didn't examine why. She just signed where Edmund indicated and watched the deed transfer and tried to understand what it meant that her name was now attached to 47 acres and a structure that a man she'd barely known had built himself from the ground up. When it was done, Edmund slid a brass key across the desk. Heavy, old, worn smooth by decades of use. Welcome home, Ms. Harmon. Then he pulled a second envelope from his drawer. Cream-colored, same as the letter. Her name on the front in Walter's handwriting, different from Edmund's older, a little uneven at the edges, the handwriting of a man with large hands who had learned to do careful things. He asked me to give you this in person, Edmund said, when you'd signed the papers, when it was real. She opened it with Edmund watching and Nora pressed close at her side. Inside was a folded card, 2 sentences. There is a secondary addendum to my estate. It cannot be opened until you and your daughter are both standing inside the cabin together. And below that, ask Nora to look at the fireplace. She read it twice. She looked at Edmund. He was a particular man, Edmund said simply. He liked to do things properly. What's the addendum? I don't know. He said this with the absolute calm of a man who had been a lawyer for 40 years and had made peace with the many things he didn't know. Whatever it is, it's in the cabin. He arranged it himself. Nora was looking at the card. Mom, she said quietly, he said to ask me. I know. He knew my name. Yes. Nora folded her hands in her lap, sat very straight, looked at Edmund with those dark eyes that were too old for her face. Then we should go see it, she said. The Forest Service road was not kind to vehicles that cared about their undercarriage. Edmund drove his ancient Chevy pickup with the ease of a man who had made this trip many times along gravel tracks that narrowed to dirt, that narrowed to something that was more of a suggestion than a road. The tree line pressing in on both sides, pine and aspen and fir. Standing so close together, they seemed to be having a private conversation they'd started long before anyone built anything in this valley. He told them about Walter as he drove, the broad outlines of a life. He'd come to Wyoming in his early 30s after his military service and couldn't settle back into cities. Took a job with a construction company for a few years, saved every penny, bought this land when it was worth nothing because it was remote and steep and the county thought it was useless. Built the cabin himself over 2 summers. Lived there alone for decades. Read everything he could get his hands on. Went to town once a month for supplies. And collected quietly over decades things he found beautiful. He talked about your family sometimes, Edmund said. Watched from a distance. Weddings, funerals. He glanced over. He said your father was the only person he ever really told the truth to. Claire felt the words land somewhere in her chest and stay there. They were friends, she said. More than that, I think. But Walter was private about it. Edmund's eyes went back to the road. He said Paul was the best man he'd ever known, and that the best thing Paul ever did was raise you. No one spoke for a moment. I barely knew Walter, Claire finally said. He knew you better than you think. They rounded a final curve. The trees fell back. And there it was. 2 stories. Hand-wrought logs, dark honey-colored from decades of weather, fitted together with a precision that could only come from someone who had cared enormously about whether the thing would last. A metal roof gone green with age. A stone chimney rising from the center like an exclamation point. A wide porch all along the front, the railings carved with patterns, leaves and birds, and something that might have been mountains or might have been waves you couldn't quite tell from a distance. And behind it, mountains, real ones, snow on the tops even now in autumn catching the evening light. Nora made a sound, not a word, just a sound. The kind that came from somewhere before language. Then she was out of the truck before it had fully stopped running across the clearing, with her arms out, a 9-year-old who had lived in a parking lot and a rest stop and a dozen other parking lots before that, now running through actual grass toward a porch that had her name on it, even if she didn't know that yet. Claire got out more slowly. Her legs were unsteady, which was funny, which was the thing her body chose to do after 2 years of being terrifyingly steady. She stood in the clearing and looked at the cabin, and something happened in her chest that she couldn't stop. Not crying. She'd done so much crying, had gotten efficient at It had turned it into something quick and private and disposable. This was something else. Something more like a door opening somewhere inside her that she had forgotten she'd closed. Edmund handed her the key. "I'll leave you to it," he said. "There's food inside and firewood enough for a few days. I'll check on you in the morning." He got back into the truck. She heard it rumble away down the Forest Service road. And then it was just her, and Nora, and the cabin, and the mountains. Nora was on the porch already running her hands along the carved railings. "Mom," she called, "come look at the birds." There were birds everywhere in the carvings. Dozens of species, each one rendered with a care that suggested someone who had spent decades watching them. Hawks and owls, small songbirds Claire couldn't name, woodpeckers. And one Nora's finger found it immediately like she'd known where to look, one that seemed different from the others. Smaller, carved more deeply, its eye more detailed, its feathers more carefully rendered, as if the person making it had slowed down for this one, had wanted this one to last differently than the others. "This one's special," Nora said. "They're all special." "No." She pressed the carved bird lightly with one finger. "Certain. This one." The key turned smoothly in the lock. The door swung open. The smell of wood smoke and pine came out first. Then something warmer underneath it. Something that had been here for decades and had settled into every surface, every grain of the wood, every stone in the chimney. The smell of a place that had been lived in with intention. They stepped inside. Nora reached for Claire's hand, found it. They stood in the main room and turned in slow circles. The massive fireplace taking up the north wall river stone fitted together in patterns that went from floor to ceiling. Bookshelves along two walls full, a kitchen to the right, stairs to the left, and light coming through the windows on three sides the last of the evening, making everything warm. "We have a home," Nora whispered. She said it like a person testing something they'd wanted for so long they no longer believed they were allowed to want it. Claire squeezed her hand. Couldn't answer. Not yet. She let Nora pull her toward the kitchen where Edmund had left provisions on the counter. Canned goods, bread, apples, 2 kinds of cheese and a jar of coffee, and thoughtful provisions that suggested someone had asked a mother of a child what they might need. On the refrigerator, held by a magnet shaped like a Wyoming state outline, was a handwritten list of instructions. How to operate the hand pump, how to start the wood stove, which breaker controlled which solar panel circuit. Walter's handwriting careful and considered, like a man who had spent a long time thinking about what the person coming after him would need to know. Then Nora stopped. She had been moving around the kitchen, touching things lightly with her fingertips, cataloging the way she cataloged everything. And then she stopped in front of the wall where the cabinets ended and the open space began, where someone had hung a single photograph. "Mom." Just the word. Claire crossed the kitchen. The photograph was black and white. 2 men standing together outside a building Claire didn't recognize. Not young, mid-30s, maybe both of them. One of them had a familiar set to his shoulders, a familiar way of standing with his weight slightly forward, like he was always about to say something that mattered. Her father, Paul Harmon. She would know him anywhere, had been looking for him in the faces of strangers for 3 years. And here he was on a wall in Wyoming in a photograph she had never seen, standing next to a man she barely remembered. Walter. She turned the photograph over with shaking hands. On the back, in the same careful handwriting as the refrigerator instructions, Paul and Walter. Casper Veterans Meeting, 1978. The only person I ever told the truth to. Claire stood in Walter Gaines's kitchen, the kitchen that was her kitchen now, and read those words and read them again. Her father had been here. Not at a funeral, not at some distant family gathering where they barely exchanged words, here specifically, in this specific county. He and Walter had known each other in the way of men who had been broken open by something difficult and had found against all odds another person who could see what was broken and not look away. 1978, 9 years before Claire was born. Her father had known this man for decades and had never told her. Or maybe he'd been waiting to tell her. Maybe he'd been waiting for the right moment. And then the cancer had come fast. Too fast, faster than any of them had expected. And suddenly there wasn't a right moment. There wasn't any moment. And some things got left unsaid, and some things got handed off to the people who were left. Nora was pressed against her side, her face tipped up. "He knew Grandpa Paul," she said. "Yes, for a long time." A very long time. Nora looked at the photograph for another moment. Then she looked at the fireplace. At the carved birds on the stones, one of them just slightly different from the others. She looked at the letter in Claire's hand. Ask Nora to look at the fireplace. She straightened up. I think, she said with the grave certainty of a 9-year-old who has decided something, we should look at that bird. The one she had noticed on the porch carved differently from all the others. The one that seemed to have been made with more care, with more intention, like someone had wanted it found. Claire looked at her daughter. This impossible, specific, improbable child. Yeah, she said. I think we should. Nora pressed the carved bird with one finger, and the floor moved. Not violently, not dramatically, with a kind of inevitability, like something that had been waiting for exactly the right person to find it and had been patient for a very long time. The stone panel in front of the fireplace separated from the rest of the floor with a sound that was barely a sound, more like a held breath finally released. Dust that had settled into the seam over the years lifted and floated in the light. The panel was maybe 4 feet square, fitted so perfectly into the surrounding floor that even standing on top of it, you'd never have felt the difference. It hinged open on some counterweight system Walter had built himself. Stone stairs going down. Steep, narrow, carved directly into the bedrock. Nora leaned forward and looked down into the dark with the expression of a child who has just discovered that the world is considerably more interesting than advertised. There's something down there, she said. Yes. Are we going? Yes. Now. Now. Claire found the flashlight in Walter's workshop on the back of the cabin, organized the way she'd learned. Walter organized everything with the same meticulous care he'd given to the carvings on the porch and the fitted stones of the chimney and the notes on the refrigerator about how to run the hand pump. A place for everything. Everything precisely in its place. She tested the beam. Strong. Good batteries. Of course there were good batteries. Walter had prepared for everything, including the possibility that someone would come looking in the dark. She pointed the beam down the stairs. 12 steps. At the bottom, the light caught the edge of something that curved a vaulted ceiling. Stone. Old. Nora was already on the first step. Wait for me, Claire said. I am waiting. She was technically. She'd stopped moving, but her whole body was inclined forward. Like gravity had a more complicated relationship with Nora than with everyone else. They went down together. The air changed immediately. Cooler, steadier. The kind of temperature that didn't shift with the seasons because it was insulated by so much stone and earth that the outside world's opinions about heat and cold didn't reach it. The smell was dry, a little like old wood, a little like something metallic. And underneath, both those things so faint Claire almost missed it, the same wood smoke and pine scent of the cabin above. Like Walter had lived in both places at once. The chamber at the bottom was nothing like she'd expected, which was fair. She hadn't expected anything. The ceiling was vaulted, supported by hand-hewn beams that had to have taken months to shape and place. The walls were smooth stone, and shelves lined them from floor to ceiling. Real shelves built into the rock itself, not added after the fact. Wooden crates stacked carefully, each one labeled in Walter's precise handwriting. Numbers and dates going back decades. Glass-fronted cabinets along one wall. An oak desk in the center, massive papers arranged in neat stacks. A journal lying open. And on the desk beside the journal, a sealed envelope with secondary addendum written on the front in Walter's hand. And the smell was everywhere down here in a way it wasn't upstairs. Because down here, stacked and packed and preserved with the care you gave to things you believed would outlast you, were paintings. Dozens of them, leaning against the walls in their wooden crates, waiting in the dark for 40 years, or 30, or 20. Patient in the way of things that have been kept by someone who understood the value of patience. Nora turned slowly, taking it in. She wasn't the kind of child who needed to talk through everything. She filed things away in a place behind her eyes and came out with them later, complete, fully formed, when she'd had time to understand what she'd taken in. She turned slowly and said nothing. Claire moved to the desk. The journal on top was open to a page covered in columns. Items, dates, numbers, dollar amounts going back to the early 1960s. Walter's handwriting younger and steadier in the early pages, growing a little more careful in the later ones, the way handwriting changed with age. Not worse exactly, just more deliberate. She didn't read it yet, because something else had caught her eye. On the desk next to the journal, not in a crate or a glass case, or wrapped in newspaper just sitting there like Walter had set it down a few minutes ago before stepping away, a book. Small, bound in leather. Clearly handmade, she could see where the binding had been done by hand, the thread visible at the spine. On the cover, in hand-lettered ink, "The Girl Who Found the House in the Woods." And below it, "For the daughter I hope she has someday." Claire's hands were moving before her brain caught up. She picked up the book, opened it. Inside the front cover, Walter's handwriting. A date, March 2019, 4 years before Nora was born. She read the first page, then the second. She sat down in Walter's chair because her legs had decided without consulting her that they were done standing for a while. The book was illustrated by hand. Every page, pencil drawings with watercolor washes rendered with the patience of someone who had made this kind of care his life's work. A girl with dark hair and serious eyes discovering a hidden house in a forest. The house growing with her over the course of the story. The girl learning what it meant to belong to a place and what it meant for a place to belong to her. And on the last page, a girl standing in front of the house looking back at the reader. Under the drawing, Walter had written, "You will be braver than you know, and you will know exactly where to look." Nora appeared at Claire's elbow. She read over her shoulder in silence. "He named her Nora," Nora said. "Yes." "He didn't know me yet." "No, he wrote it before you were born." Nora looked at the illustrated girl on the final page. The dark hair, the serious eyes. The girl standing in front of a house that looked, Claire realized with a shock, she felt in her whole body remarkably like this cabin. "He hoped for me," Nora said. Not a question. A statement of something she was working to understand. "Yes." Nora took the book from Claire's hands carefully. Both hands. The way she handled things she'd decided were important. She turned back to the first page and started from the beginning, standing right there in the underground chamber, with the flashlight balanced on the desk, reading Walter's handwritten story to herself. Claire sat in the chair and let her. She needed a minute anyway. She reached for the sealed envelope marked "Secondary Addendum." Opened it. Inside was a single card in Walter's handwriting. "Everything in this room belongs to you and Nora. No exceptions, no conditions. It is yours as surely as the cabin above you. I wanted you to find the book first. W.G." She set the card on the desk. The addendum was the vault itself, the storybook, the paintings, the collection he had spent 40 years building, all of it sealed and waiting for exactly this moment. When she finally turned to the journal, the numbers there hit differently than numbers usually hit, because she'd already met Walter through his handwriting on the refrigerator, through his note in Edmund's envelope, through his storybook for a daughter he hoped Claire would have. So when she opened the journal and started reading, calmly line by line, the way you read something you're not sure you're ready to understand, the dollar amounts that began to add up felt personal, not abstract, not impossible. Just Walter had spent 40 years finding beautiful things, and beautiful things, it turned out, accumulated. She read for an hour, maybe more. Nora had finished the storybook and moved on to carefully opening the nearest wooden crate using a small pry bar she'd found leaning against the desk like it had been placed there specifically for this purpose. Which it probably had. Inside, yellow newspaper from 1966. Beneath that, a painting. Mountains and sky in oil on canvas, the strokes confident and dramatic. The light doing something that light rarely did, in paintings actually looking like light, instead of paint that had been convinced to imitate light. The signature in the corner was from the journal entries. Thomas Langford. Claire had taken an art history survey course during nursing school. The name surfaced from somewhere in her memory. American landscape painter, 19th century. Known for his Rocky Mountain views, the dramatic light he coaxed from oil and canvas. Died in 1891. Works scattered across private collections and smaller regional museums. She turned to the journal page that referenced this painting. Purchased 1963 estate sale, Portland, $375. Current value 1994 appraisal, $47,000. She kept reading. She made her way through the journal while Nora moved systematically from crate to crate, handling each thing with a carefulness that would have impressed professional archivists. Books with spines she couldn't read. Stock certificates in names she half recognized. More paintings. A bronze sculpture wrapped in cloth that turned green when she moved it into the flashlight beam. Coins in velvet cases, each one labeled in Walter's hand. The journal's final accounting was dated 6 months before Walter died. Claire turned to it. She read the total. She read it again. $265 million. She set the journal down on the desk, stood up, sat back down, stood up again. Because sitting and standing had both become inadequate responses to $265 million, and she couldn't decide which one was marginally better. Nora, she said, come here for a second. Nora came. She was holding a small painting, unframed, the canvas corners slightly curled, wrapped in newspaper from 1971. In her other hand, a note she'd found tucked between the canvas and the newspaper. This one's weird, she said. What's the note say? Nora read it out loud. Junk sale billings, 1971, $12. Didn't know who painted it. Bought it because it was beautiful. Claire took the painting. It was small, maybe 18 by 12 inches. A landscape, a river valley at dusk, the kind of light that turned everything it touched to something more than it was. The painter had done something with shadows that made them feel alive rather than absent. And in the lower right corner, in paint so thinly applied, you almost missed it, a signature. E. Drummond. The name was not in Walter's journal, but something about the painting, the quality of it, the way the light moved, the age of the canvas visible in the texture, something made Claire set it carefully on the desk and commit it to memory. She would ask Ruth Caldwell tomorrow. Ruth came in the morning exactly as she said she would. She knocked at 8, and Claire had already been awake for 2 hours, sitting at Walter's kitchen table with the journal and a cup of coffee, doing the kind of math that made ordinary life feel like a fever dream you couldn't quite shake. Nora was still asleep upstairs, the storybook tucked against her side, holding it the way she'd once held her stuffed rabbit, like something that could protect you if you held it right. Ruth Caldwell was 62 years old, with reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and the bearing of someone who had spent 4 decades turning libraries into sanctuaries for people who needed somewhere to think. She ran the Fremont County branch in Lander, the nearest real library 40 minutes from the cabin on the paved road. She had driven up without being asked. She carried a folder and a casserole. Walter said you might not have had time to cook, she said. He asked me to bring food if the day ever came. Claire stood in the doorway. He planned for everything, she said. It was a thing he did, yes. Ruth set the casserole on the counter and sat down at the table without being asked, which was something you could do when you'd known a place long enough. He gave me this folder 3 years ago, said to keep it, to give it to whoever came to claim the cabin when it was real, when the papers were signed. She slid it across the table, inside a letter, and behind it a typed document with Edmund Lark's letterhead. Claire read the letter first. Walter's handwriting. Steadier than his later notes, this was from a few years earlier, when his hand had more certainty. It said, Ruth has been good to me. She brought books. She didn't ask questions I wasn't ready to answer. I'm leaving her this letter to give you because I wanted someone alive to witness what I'm about to say. I watched your family from a distance. I saw what they did and what they took, and how you refused to stop getting up. I saw the light go out of your eyes twice and come back twice, and that's harder than people who've never lost anything understand. Your father saw it too. He saw it first, actually. He told me about it the year before the cancer got bad, when he still thought there might be time. There wasn't in the end, so I had to be. Ruth was watching her, not intruding, witnessing, which Claire was learning was what Ruth Caldwell did. He cared about you, Ruth said simply. It wasn't complicated for him. It's complicated for me. I know. Ruth nodded at the folder. Read the other one too. The typed document was a legal record, an update to Walter's will dated 3 years ago. The update included a specific clause upon my death. Neither Diane Harmon nor Marcus Harmon shall receive any portion of my estate in any form for any reason. This clause supersedes any prior designation or claim. Below that, in a handwritten addendum, if they come and they will, Edmund knows what to do. Claire set the document down. 3 years ago, she said. Yes. Why did he update it 3 years ago? Ruth folded her hands on the table. Because 3 years ago, your sister drove up here. The words landed like something dropped from a height. Diane. She went to Edmund's office first. He wouldn't see her. So she sent Walter a letter. Ruth's voice was even. Factual, not unkind. She wanted to be named beneficiary. Said she was better positioned to manage his estate than her words, a financially irresponsible relative with an unstable home situation. Financially irresponsible, Claire repeated. Walter didn't reply to her letter. He drove to Edmund's office the following week and dictated that clause. Ruth pushed her glasses up. He was furious. I'd never seen him furious before. He was a very contained man. But that week he was furious. The knowledge settled into Claire's chest, cold, clarifying. Diane had known, had come here to this county, to this lawyer's office 3 years ago, while Walter was alive, before the Spokane breakdown, before the apartment, before the parking lots, before everything fell apart. And she had tried to cut Claire out before the inheritance even became real. Blood didn't mean what Claire had been told it meant. She'd known that. But knowing something and seeing the documentation of it were different things. She'll come, Claire said. Yes. She'll claim I can't manage this, that I'm unstable, that Nora deserves better. She'll try. Claire looked at the document, at Walter's handwriting in the addendum. Edmund knows what to do. Does he? She asked. Does Edmund know what to do? He's been preparing for this for 3 years, Ruth said. Walter made sure of it. The night the legal papers arrived, Claire went back to the vault alone. She didn't mean to. She'd meant to read Edmund's email on her phone. She had service near the south window, barely enough for email, and she'd meant to take in what it said calmly and practically and go to bed at a reasonable hour and deal with it in the morning. The email wasn't short. Diane had filed a petition for legal guardianship of Claire and protective oversight of the estate, on the grounds that Claire's documented history of housing instability and financial difficulties demonstrated a pattern of judgment failure that posed a genuine risk to the management of significant inherited assets. They were also raising questions about whether the cabin's conditions, no grid power, limited access, remote location, constituted adequate housing for a minor child, which meant Nora. They were raising questions about Nora. Claire read it twice. Then she went to the vault. Not because she needed to look at the money. The money wasn't why she went down there. She went because it was Walter's. Because his handwriting was everywhere in it. Because the crates he'd packed and the shelves he'd built and the journal he'd kept for decades were all his. All the evidence of a life spent caring about things that mattered. And right now, she needed to be near someone who had believed she deserved this even before she believed it herself. She sat on the floor, with her back against the stone wall and her knees drawn up and the journal in her lap. She read the part where Walter wrote in 1994 about a niece he'd watched from a distance. How he'd decided sometime in the 1990s that whatever he'd built would go to her when the time came. He wrote, "She gives without counting." That's rare, that's worth protecting. She gives without counting. She pressed her hands against her eyes. Okay, listen. Listen to me. You can't let them do this. You have Edmund. You have the document from 3 years ago. You have, but she was so tired. That was the thing no one talked about. Not the fighting itself, but the exhaustion that came before the fighting. The way 2 years of survival had eaten through whatever reserve she'd had, and what was left wasn't much. And now she was supposed to marshal what was left and stand in a courtroom, while her siblings told a judge that she'd failed her daughter by not being rich enough. Maybe she should just sign. Maybe that was the sane thing. Take the cabin. Take the land. Let them have the rest and just stop. Just stop fighting and give Nora a home and live here quietly and not spend the next year being taken apart in public. Maybe Walter wouldn't have wanted no. Stop. He said, stand firm. He said it exactly. Stand firm. He said she was talking to herself out loud now. In a vault. At 11 o'clock at night. Alone. She pressed the journal against her chest and sat on the stone floor and let herself shake for exactly as long as she needed to, which was longer than she would have preferred. She didn't hear Nora on the stairs. The stairs were stone, and Nora had learned a long time ago how to move without making noise. A skill you picked up when you lived in a car and needed to get to the restroom at 3 in the morning without waking anyone. She appeared in the flashlight's beam like a small, serious apparition, barefoot, hair loose, still holding the storybook. She looked at her mother on the floor. She sat down next to her. She didn't say, "Are you okay?" because they'd both agreed 2 years ago that "are you okay?" was a stupid question with a useless answer, and they'd retired it from regular use. She said, "Are they trying to take it?" "Yes." "The money?" "And you?" "They're raising questions about whether I'm providing adequate care, about the cabin, the conditions." Silence. Nora looked at the ceiling, at the vaulted stone held up by beams Walter had shaped himself. They weren't worried about you in the parking lot, she said. No. They weren't worried about you when we slept in the bus station. No. They're only worried now because of the money. Yes. So their worry is about the money, Nora said. Not about me, not about you, about the money. She said it like she was setting something down, filing it correctly. Claire, she said. She almost never called her mother Claire, only when she meant something very specifically. What? Walter wrote me a story before I was born. She held up the book, still holding it like she had been holding it all night. He put it at the top of everything in this room so we'd find it first. He put it there before the money, before the paintings, before all of it. She paused. He's been waiting for us. He waited a really long time. She looked at her mother. Don't make him wait anymore. Claire sat on the stone floor, looked at her 9-year-old daughter. This 9-year-old daughter who had navigated 3 states on a paper map and cataloged a vault full of artwork with the systematic care of an archivist, and who still held the storybook against her chest like armor. She put her arm around her. Nora leaned in. I'm not signing anything, Claire said. Good. It's going to be hard. I know. They're going to say things that are hard to hear. I know. Nora leaned her head against Claire's shoulder. But we're not in the parking lot anymore. No, they were not in the parking lot anymore. They were in a vault under a log cabin in Wyoming that Walter Gaines had built with his own hands. They were surrounded by things he had spent 40 years finding beautiful. They were sitting under a vaulted stone ceiling that had not moved in 4 decades and was not going to move because it had been built by someone who cared about permanence, who had learned to value permanence, who had decided long before he died that permanence was what he wanted to give them. They stayed there a while longer. Then they went upstairs to sleep. The call from Owen came 3 days later. Not from Diane, not from Marcus. From Owen, which Claire had not expected, and which was the first time in 2 years she had heard his voice with anything in it other than the particular blankness of a person who had decided not to pick a side. He called at 7 in the morning. She was on the porch with coffee watching the frost burn off the grass in the clearing. Claire. His voice was different, something stripped out of it that had always been there before. I need to tell you something, and then I'm going to hang up, and you're not going to hear from me for a while. And that's not because I don't... He stopped. Just listen. I'm listening. Diane went to Wyoming 3 years ago. He said it fast. Like if he didn't say it fast, he wouldn't say it at all. She went to the lawyer's office in Casper, Edmund Lark, tried to get herself named beneficiary. He wouldn't deal with her. I know, Claire said. A pause. You know, I have the document. Walter updated his will after, specifically excluding her and Marcus. Silence on the line. She heard him exhale, like he'd been holding something heavy and had set it down. Okay, he said. Okay, so you have that. Why are you calling Owen? Because she knew. His voice went harder. Something in it she hadn't heard since they were kids, before everything calcified. She knew about the collection, not the specifics, but she knew Walter had things down there. She had someone look up his name after Dad's funeral. I don't know how she found the museum article. There was one from 1984 about an anonymous donor, and she put it together somehow. She knew he had money. That's why she went. The morning air felt colder. She's been sitting on this for 3 years, Claire said. She moved fast when the news broke. She already had a lawyer lined up. She already had the guardianship paperwork ready. A pause. It wasn't spontaneous, Claire. She planned this. The guardianship petition had arrived 8 days after Edmund had filed the deed transfer. 8 days. Because they'd already planned it. Because Diane had spent 3 years waiting for the moment when whatever Walter had left would transfer, and had arranged every piece of the legal response in advance. She looked out at the mountains. The frost was nearly gone. Why are you telling me this now? She asked. Owen was quiet for a moment. Because I watched what they did to you, he finally said. With Dad's insurance money. And I didn't say anything. And I told myself it was complicated, that it was hard to get in the middle of family things, that they had their reasons. His voice dropped. They didn't have reasons. They just took what wasn't theirs and I let them because it was easier for me. He stopped. I can't let them do it again, he said. So I'm telling you, and I'll testify if you need me to. I'll send you the texts. There are texts between me and Diane from 3 years ago when she was putting this together. I kept them. I don't know why. Maybe I knew someday I'd need to show someone. Send them, she said. Already done. Owen, don't thank me. I'm 3 years late. His voice was final about this, not inviting argument. Just don't let them take it. Walter wanted it to be yours. I saw what he saw in you. I always saw it. I just didn't have the guts to say so. A pause. You're better at this than they are. At all of it. Surviving things, growing things. You always were. He hung up. She sat on the porch for a long time after. The frost was gone. The clearing was bright. And somewhere in the grass under the shadow of the porch eave, a small bird was singing something complicated and persistent, the kind of song that had no apparent purpose beyond the fact of itself. Beyond the fact that it was morning, and the bird was alive, and the morning was here. Claire set down her coffee, went inside, opened her email to Edmund Lark, and started writing. Ruth came back that afternoon with something new in the folder. Not a legal document, just a page she'd found in Walter's desk at the library, the small desk he used when he came in for research, which was several times a year, which she'd thought nothing of at the time. The page had a single paragraph, Walter's handwriting, undated. The painting I bought for $12 in Billings in 1971, I had it looked at in 1993. The museum man said it was lost, that Elias Drummond's estate had been looking for it for 60 years. I asked what it was worth. He told me. I thanked him and drove home and put it back in the vault. I didn't buy it for money. I don't want to sell it for money. But whoever finds this afterwards should know it's not just a painting I found beautiful. It's a painting a lot of people have been looking for a very long time. Claire read the note, looked at Ruth. 40 million, Ruth said quietly. I had it estimated, unofficially, by a colleague in Denver who does this kind of work. $40 million for a painting Walter bought because it was beautiful. For $12. For $12 from a junk sale in Billings because he walked past it and it made the light do something real. Claire sat with that for a moment. The man Walter had been settling more fully into place. Not a man who found things because he understood their value. A man who found things because he understood beauty, and who had spent 40 years trusting that beauty and value in the end were the same thing. This is all going to come out, Claire said. When the legal case starts, it's all going to be public. Yes, they're going to say I'm not equipped. They're going to try. I need to be ready. Ruth looked at her over the reading glasses. You've been ready, she said, for considerably longer than you know. Outside through the window, the mountains were doing the thing they did in the late afternoon, catching the light at an angle that turned them from stone to something else, something more. A transformation you could watch happen if you were the kind of person who looked up. Claire had forgotten to look up for a while. She was remembering now. The weeks between the petition and the hearing were the longest of Claire's life, which was saying something. Edmund Lark moved with the quiet efficiency of a man who had been preparing for exactly this moment for 3 years and was not going to waste it being theatrical about it. He came to the cabin twice a week. He sat at Walter's kitchen table with his briefcase and his reading glasses and his legal pads, and he built the case piece by piece the way Walter had built the cabin, one beam at a time, with attention to what would last. We have Owen's texts, he said the first morning. Yes, we have the amended will. Yes, we have Ruth's testimony about Diane's visit 3 years ago. He made a note. We have medical evaluations confirming your competency, character references from Sister Agnes, school records showing Nora's consistent attendance and academic performance throughout. He paused, chose his next word carefully. Throughout the period of housing transition. Housing transition. That's what lawyers called sleeping in parking lots. What about the petition itself, Claire asked. What are they actually claiming? That your history demonstrates a pattern of judgment, failure that constitutes a risk to the estate. That the cabin's conditions, the remote location, the off-grid infrastructure, are insufficient for a child. He looked at her over his glasses. And that as the surviving adult relatives with professional and financial stability, Your siblings are better positioned to ensure Nora's welfare. Nora's welfare. Her 9-year-old daughter, who had navigated 3 states on a paper map and cataloged a priceless art collection and offered to testify before she'd even been asked. They're using Nora against me, Claire said. They're trying to. Edmund closed his folder. We're going to make sure the judge understands who Nora actually is. The courthouse in Casper was 3 stories of Wyoming sandstone that had been standing since 1917 and looked like it intended to keep standing for another century, regardless of what anyone thought about it. The building did not suggest flexibility. Claire wore the blouse she'd bought the week after they arrived at the cabin, the first new piece of clothing she'd purchased in 2 years. Navy blue. She'd stood in the store holding it for 10 minutes before she could make herself believe she was the kind of person who could have a new blouse. She was that kind of person. Nora wore the navy dress, again, because it was her armor and she knew it. They walked up the courthouse steps together and stopped, because the steps were already occupied. Ruth Caldwell was there with the folder. Sister Agnes had driven 6 hours from Portland, which she had not mentioned she was planning to do, and she stood near the top of the steps in the no-nonsense way of a woman who had spent 22 years refusing to be moved by anyone who tried. Edmund's assistant, a young woman named Cora, who had decided this case was worth her Saturday, stood near the door with a rolling case of documents. And behind them, ranged down the steps, like they had organized this, like they had talked to each other and decided together because this was the kind of county that did things like this, where people Claire barely knew. The mechanic who'd fixed the Escape's brake light 2 weeks ago and refused payment. The woman from the general store who'd slipped an extra bag of coffee into her order without comment. The pastor from the church in Lander where Nora had been attending Sunday school for a month. Sheriff Dale Pryor in full uniform, which was a statement. They've come to watch, Edmund said quietly beside her. They've come to show up, Nora corrected, which was not the same thing, which was in fact the opposite thing. Inside the courtroom, Diane sat with her attorney and imported one expensive suit, the kind of man who cost a significant amount of money per hour and made sure you knew it. Marcus sat next to her, Petra at the end of the row, all of them in coordinated professional attire, the visual presentation of competence and concern. Diane met Claire's eyes as she walked to the respondents' table and smiled, the smile of a person who believed she had already won. The judge was a woman in her late 50s named Carolyn Marsh, who had presided over the Natrona County Circuit for 11 years, and whose expression from the moment she took her seat communicated that she had seen approximately everything and was not easily impressed by any of it. She looked at both tables. She looked at the public gallery, which was unusual, and she said, "Let's hear it." Diane's attorney went first. He was good at what he did, which was making a sympathetic story out of unsympathetic facts. He talked about Claire's 2 years of housing instability, the nursing license that had lapsed, the documented difficulty maintaining consistent employment. He used phrases like concerning pattern and history of instability and genuine questions about capacity, and he said them all with the tone of a man who had rehearsed being sad about it. He mentioned the Ford Escape. He mentioned the parking lot. He mentioned the granola bar. That last one, how he'd found out about the granola bar, Claire didn't know, except that the text messages Owen had sent also included conversations he'd had with Diane, and somewhere in those conversations, Claire's daily reality had been mined for details. That last one was the one that made her want to leave her body for a moment. Because she had stood in the parking lot of a Target store every morning and broken a granola bar in half and given Nora the bigger piece and thought she was alone in that. Thought that was hers, that small, quiet thing. And now it was in a courtroom, evidence of her failure. She did not look at Nora, because she knew if she looked at Nora, she would not be able to stay steady. So she looked at the judge instead. When Edmund's turn came, he was not theatrical about it. He put the amended will on the table. He showed the judge the clause Walter had added 3 years ago, with the date and Edmund's own notarized witness, and the explanation Walter had provided in an accompanying letter, his reasons for the exclusion documented in Walter's own hand, factual and clear. He put Owen's text messages on the record. 3 years of conversations between Owen and Diane in which Diane had discussed Walter's estate with the certainty of someone who had already decided she owned it, who had retained a legal consultant, who had tracked the deed transfer the morning it was filed. Ms. Diane Harmon moved with premeditated intent within 8 days of the deed transfer, Edmund said. This was not a spontaneous response to concerns about her sister's welfare. This was a plan she had held in reserve for 3 years. Diane's attorney objected. The judge looked at the text. She overruled it. Then Edmund called Nora. She walked to the witness stand without being prompted, sat down, adjusted the microphone without being told it needed adjusting because she was 9 years old and had been paying attention to everything that happened in this room since they walked in. Nora, the judge said, "Do you understand why you're here today?" "Yes, ma'am." "Can you tell me, my aunts and uncle want to say my mom can't take care of me because we lived in a car." She said it without looking at her hands, without performing anything, just saying the thing that was true in the tone of a person who had decided a long time ago that true was better than easy. And because they think she can't manage money. "And what do you think about that?" Nora was quiet for a moment. "My mom never missed a school day," she said. "When we were in the parking lot, she walked me to the bus stop every morning and waited until the bus came, and then she walked back and applied for jobs all day, and then walked back to get me from the bus stop." She paused. "She never told me not to apply for the food bank's free lunch program because it was embarrassing. She told me free programs exist because communities decided that children should eat, and that using them was not something to be ashamed of." Diane's attorney was writing something. The judge was not writing anything. The judge was watching Nora with the expression of someone who had asked a question expecting a standard answer and had received something considerably more. "She never let me see how scared she was," Nora continued. "I knew she was. I could tell. But she decided every morning to not let the scared make the decisions. She let the other thing make the decisions." "What other thing?" the judge asked. Nora thought about it. "The part that kept getting up," she said. The courtroom was very quiet. "My great-uncle Walter left us this property," Nora said. "He left it specifically to us. He wrote me a story before I was born about finding a house in the woods. He put it at the top of everything in the room so we'd find it first." She looked at the judge directly. "He didn't know me yet when he wrote it, but he knew my mom. He watched her from a distance for a long time, and he decided she was the kind of person who deserved something good. My aunts and uncle weren't there when we needed help. Walter was, just from far away and quietly." She folded her hands on the table in front of her. "He trusted my mom," she said. "I trust my mom. I think a judge who looks at the evidence will too." She stepped down without being dismissed, walked back to the table, sat down next to Claire, who was very carefully not looking at Nora, because if she looked at Nora, she was going to cry in a courtroom in front of a judge, and her sibling's attorney, and about 40 people from Fremont and Natrona counties who had come to watch, and she was not going to do that. She looked at the judge. The judge was still watching the spot where Nora had been sitting. Then Edmund said, "Your Honor, I'd like to submit a video statement." The large screen at the front of the courtroom came to life, and Walter appeared. Not young 87, maybe 88 in the video, sitting at the desk in the cabin's main room. The shelves of books behind him. The carvings on the fireplace visible at the edge of the frame. He was wearing a flannel shirt. He sat with his hands flat on the desk, the way a man sat when he had something important to say and wanted his body to know it too. His voice was clear, lower than she'd expected. A voice that had been used sparingly and carefully the way you use tools you respected. "My name is Walter James Gaines. I am recording this in October as a formal addendum to my estate documents. Edmund Lark has witnessed this recording, and the date will be notarized." He looked directly into the camera. The way people looked at cameras when they were talking to someone specific, not at some unknown future audience, but at a person they had something to say to. "I have watched Claire Harmon for a long time, closer than she knew. I want that on record." He shifted slightly. 8 years ago, I began making monthly contributions to St. Bridget's Women's Shelter in Portland, Oregon. I did this anonymously. I will tell you why." He paused. The kind of pause that meant what came next had been considered for a long time. Paul Harmon was the best man I ever knew. He was also a man who spent a great deal of his life worrying that his children would pay for his mistakes. He was particularly worried about Claire, not because she was weak, because she was the one who gave without counting the cost, and in a family where people kept score that made her vulnerable. He paid attention to the shelter because Claire used it for her mailing address. He knew what that meant. When the nursing license lapsed, when I found out from Edmund, who monitored her situation at my request, I doubled the shelter's monthly contribution. I wanted to make sure that if she needed to come back, the door would be open. In the gallery, Sister Agnes sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the screen. Not surprised, just witnessing. I did not tell her. That was deliberate. She didn't need a benefactor. She needed a safety net she didn't have to think about. She was busy keeping Nora alive, and that required all her attention. Walter put both hands flat on the desk. To any court reviewing this estate, I was of sound mind when I made these decisions. I am of sound mind now. Claire Harmon is not incompetent. She is a person who has been systematically disadvantaged by the people who should have supported her and who has refused to stop getting up despite that. I have watched her refuse to stop getting up for 23 years. I consider it one of the most remarkable things I've ever witnessed. He looked at the camera. I leave my estate to her because she earned it. Not by suffering. Suffering isn't an earning mechanism. By being consistently and against significant resistance, a person worth betting on. He folded his hands. He said, Paul, if there's anywhere you can hear this, I kept my promise. The screen went dark. The courtroom was very quiet for a moment. Then Diane's attorney said, Your Honor, this video. I've seen it, the judge said. The production of this kind of... Mr. Farrow. The judge's voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. I have seen it. Sit down. He sat down. Sister Agnes was the last witness. She stood at the front of the courtroom in the posture of a woman who had spent 22 years dealing with things considerably harder than skeptical lawyers, and she confirmed what Walter had said. Monthly contributions for 8 years, anonymous, structured through a third-party nonprofit that dispersed funds without identifying the donor. He never identified himself, she said. I found out after he died from Edmund Lark's office. We had been calling him our angel for 6 years. She paused. When I found out it was Walter Gaines, when I found out it was the man who left Claire the cabin, I understood that he hadn't just left her a property. He'd been taking care of her for a long time. He'd just been doing it where she couldn't see it. Judge Marsh looked at the petitioner's table. Diane was very still. Marcus had his arms crossed, the posture of a man who had expected to win and was now recalculating. Petra was looking at her hands. The judge made some notes. She looked at both tables. I've reviewed the petition, she said. The evidence provided, the testimony. She set down her pen. The argument that Ms. Harmon lacks the capacity to manage her inheritance is not supported by any credible evidence. The argument that the cabin's conditions are inadequate for a child is undermined by the child's own testimony regarding her health, her education, and her clearly demonstrated emotional stability. She looked at Diane. The argument that the petitioner's motivations are protective rather than financial is contradicted by 3 years of documented preparation, an amended will specifically excluding them, and a video statement by the deceased that predicts with reasonable accuracy exactly this legal action. She picked up the gavel. The petition for guardianship is denied. The estate remains with Claire Harmon in its entirety. Petitioners are ordered to pay all legal costs incurred by the respondent in defending this action. The gavel came down. The sound of it was very clean. Diane's attorney was already talking to her in a low voice. Marcus pushed back from the table. Petra cried, which could have been genuine or could have been the thing she always did when a performance was ending. It didn't particularly matter. Claire sat at the table for a moment, just sitting. Edmund was packing his papers. Nora put her hand on Claire's arm. Mom, she said. Yeah. Are you okay? I don't know yet. That's okay. Nora's hand stayed on her arm. You don't have to know yet. They walked out through the public gallery. Ruth, who was not a hugger by nature, hugged Claire. Sister Agnes put both hands on Claire's face and looked at her the way she looked at women who had come through something that was supposed to break them. Sheriff Pryor shook her hand and said something about giving them a call if the siblings decided to make trouble on the drive home. The mechanic nodded. The woman from the general store nodded. The pastor said something she didn't fully hear but felt anyway. They went back to the cabin. The day was cold and clear in the way of Wyoming fall, the sky doing that impossible thing it did when the season was changing, and the light came in sideways, and everything it touched looked like it was being seen for the first time. They were an hour out of Casper when Nora fell asleep in the back seat. And Claire drove, and thought about what Walter had said. I kept my promise. That night when Nora was asleep and the cabin was quiet, and the fire in the wood stove had settled to coals, Claire went back to the vault. Not for the collection. For the thing she hadn't yet opened. Edmund had mentioned it briefly at the end of the hearing. A fireproof safe in Walter's workshop. Small, standard combination lock. The combination had taken Edmund himself 3 weeks to find. It was the date of Walter's military discharge, a number Walter had apparently carried with him for the rest of his life. Inside the safe, Edmund had told her some documents, and a letter addressed to her, not in Walter's handwriting, in her father's. She sat at the desk in the vault with the letter in her hands. The paper was thicker than she'd expected. 3 years old, written when his hands were already fighting to stay steady. She knew that handwriting better than she knew her own. Had watched it change over the course of his illness, the letters getting more deliberate as his hands lost certainty, the pressure uneven, the spacing occasionally wrong. She knew what it cost him to write this. She opened it. Dear Claire, I don't have much time left and there are things I should have told you sooner. I'm going to try to say them now in the order they matter. First, I know about what your siblings did with the insurance money. I wasn't as confused in those last months as they seemed to think. I heard things. I understood more than I let on. I'm sorry I couldn't intervene. I was dying and I was angry, and in the end the anger took more energy than I had. Second, I went to see Walter. She stopped reading. She read that sentence again. Second, I went to see Walter. I drove to Casper in March. Told your brother I was going to a doctor's appointment. I needed to see Walter face to face for what I was going to ask him. You don't ask something like this in a phone call. I told him what was happening, about the money your siblings took, about what I could see coming for you, about Nora, who I love more than I can put into words, and who deserves everything good the world has, and who I'm not going to be here to provide. I asked him if he would be the safety net. He said he already had some things in place. I asked him if he would leave you the cabin. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I've been thinking about it for years. Your asking me just made it certain. I should have introduced you to Walter years ago. He was the best person I knew outside of you. He understood things without having to have them explained. He'd watched you from a distance. I'd told him about you for years every time we talked, and he decided you were worth watching. He said you were the kind of person who gave without keeping score, which is a rare thing, and he respected it more than almost anything else. I'm leaving you in good hands, not just his. I'm leaving you in the hands of who you've always been. Because you are Claire, you are the strongest person I have ever known. Not because you never break. You do break. I've watched you break. But you put yourself back together faster and steadier than anyone I've ever seen. And then you go right back to making sure the people you love are okay. That is not weakness. That is the strength that doesn't get celebrated enough in this world. Use the cabin. Use whatever Walter left you. Build something. Build whatever makes Nora stand up the way you stand up. One more thing. The last line was in smaller writing, like he'd almost not included it, but had decided at the last moment that it had to be said. I see you clearly. I always have. I'm sorry I didn't say it more often in more specific ways when there was more time. Love, Dad. Claire sat in the vault for a long time after. Not on the floor this time, in Walter's chair. With her father's letter in her hands, the thing she kept coming back to was not the money, not the collection, not the $40 million painting Walter had bought for $12 because it was beautiful. The thing she kept coming back to was, he saw you clearly. I always have. Her father had driven to Wyoming with cancer in his body and a finite number of days left, and had sat across from Walter Gaines and said, take care of her. Please, in the way that meant, I know you will, but I need to say it out loud. And Walter had said, I already have some things in place. 8 years of anonymous funding to a shelter in Portland, a cabin in Wyoming, a storybook for a daughter who hadn't been born yet, a video statement made before he died predicting exactly what would happen and making sure it was documented. Walter had been taking care of them, and Paul had known, and neither of them had said a word, because that was how they had loved her, quietly, from wherever they could reach. She sat in Walter's chair in Walter's vault with her father's letter until the fire in the wood stove upstairs needed tending. Then she folded the letter carefully, put it back in the envelope, and put the envelope in her pocket. She went upstairs. She built up the fire. She stood at the south window and looked at the mountains in the dark. They were there. Even in the dark, even invisible, she could feel them. There. The Walter Gaines Foundation for Single Mothers opened 14 months after the court hearing. The community center was 40 minutes from the cabin in a building that had previously housed a farm supply store and that two local contractors had converted over the course of 8 months, working around their regular jobs because they believed in the project and because Walter Gaines had been quietly good to this county for 30 years, and this was a way to honor that. It offered legal aid, emergency housing assistance, job training, child care so mothers could attend job training. It offered a library. Ruth Caldwell helped build the collection. By the end of the first year, the foundation had served 83 families. Not a round number, an exact number. Claire kept exact numbers because exact numbers were how you respected the people behind them. She got her nursing license back. The fee was $230. She paid it. It cost her nothing. 3 years after the day she and Nora had walked through the cabin door together, Claire stood in the foundation's main hall on a Saturday morning in October. The light came through the windows at an angle that reminded her of Wyoming fall, which was fitting. Nora was 12 now and taller than Claire had expected and carried a notebook everywhere she went, which was not the same notebook as before. Those had been filled and set aside on the shelf in her bedroom, but was recognizably hers. The same careful observation, the same serious eyes. She still drew houses, but the houses had changed. More windows, open ones, more doors, more stick figures in front. Not 3, but sometimes 7 or 12 or 20, a whole community of them, rendered with the patient attention of someone who understood that it mattered to show up on the page, that being drawn meant being seen. A girl came into the hall that morning, 8 years old, holding her mother's hand. The mother was 32 and had the bearing of a person who had been through something and was on the far side of it, but hadn't yet started to believe the far side was real. Nora watched them come in. She went to the supply table where she'd left the things she'd brought from home. She'd been making it for 2 weeks. A small book bound in the same way Walter had bound his because she'd practiced and practiced until the binding was right. Each page illustrated in pencil and watercolor. The story of a girl who discovers a house that had been built for her by someone she'd never met and what she builds with what she finds there. She walked over to the 8-year-old. "Hi," she said. The girl looked at her. "Sire, I made this." Nora held out the book. "It's about finding a home. I thought maybe you'd want to read it." The girl took it, opened the first page. A cabin in the woods. A girl standing in front of it. A clearing. Mountains in the distance. And in front of the cabin, 3 stick figures holding hands. The 8-year-old looked up. "Who are they?" "A mom," Nora said. "A kid. And someone who loved them from far away and made sure they'd be okay even after he was gone." She handed the book over completely, walked back to her mother, and Claire put her arm around her daughter, who was 12 years old and had navigated 3 states on a paper map and cataloged a vault full of artwork and testified with perfect calm in a Wyoming courthouse, and who still drew every single day houses with light coming through the windows and many people standing in front. "She'll read it tonight," Nora said. "Probably. And then maybe she'll make one too. Maybe." Nora looked out the hall's south-facing windows at the mountain range visible on the horizon, an hour's drive, and a whole world away from the courthouse steps and the 2 sisters in the car she'd grown up in. "I figured out who the third figure always was," she said. "Yeah, the one I couldn't explain in all the drawings." Claire looked at her. "Walter," Nora said. "He was always there. He was just in a different place, watching from wherever he was, making sure the picture was right." She picked up her own notebook, opened to a fresh page, and started drawing. 3 figures in front of a house. A mom, a kid, and someone standing a little to the side watching them both, not in the center, not demanding to be noticed, just there. Just present. The way you were present when you loved someone without keeping score. When you built something that would outlast you so the people you cared about could find it when they finally needed it most. The way you stayed even after you were gone. The mountain light came through the windows and fell across Nora's notebook, and she drew, and Claire watched her draw. And somewhere out in the Wyoming fall, the aspens were turning gold, and the first frost of the season was settling into the grass of a clearing in Fremont County, where a cabin stood on 47 acres that had been built by a man who understood what it meant to believe in something even before you could prove it would turn out. He had believed, he had built, and it had lasted.